Swinburne University of Technology.
Hello, welcome to another instructional or introductory video for PhD students in the writing program here at Swinburne. Today we're going to be looking at the topic of ethics applications and ethics clearance for research projects at Swinburne. And joining us today is Mr. Keith Wilkins from the Research Ethics and Integrity Office within Swinburne Research. So Keith, thanks for coming and joining us.
My pleasure.
Great. Well, could you start by maybe talking a little bit generally about the Research Ethics and Integrity Office and what role that plays in Swinburne Research?
Well, Swinburne Research has this responsibility for governing or handling research governance. Now, part of research governance is meeting standards and guidelines and so on. And part of my area, or the area in which I work, is concerned with the independent ethical review of research proposals.
Right.
More particularly in terms of our conversation for research that comes under the definition of human research. We also do some very rare animal work, but that's extremely rare at Swinburne, and also biosafety and so on. And that is set in a regulated framework, externally and internally. In order for Swinburne to get access to research funding, it's required to have this process in place. Some laws also apply, mainly privacy laws, for example, and therapeutic goods and so on. I mean, some of this started originally, I guess you might say, in the biomedical field, but it's expanded to encompass all research. And our office really is to keep this process going and to ensure that the university is satisfying compliance requirements.
Great. So it's important for research funding and the functioning of research at Swinburne for the research projects to comply with these determined ethical standards.
That's right.
Great. Now, perhaps, I'm sorry, going a little off topic here, but perhaps maybe we could get a general definition of what falls under the category of human research.
The definition, which is actually covered in this document, which is the basic guide. So these are the two standards, in fact, that we're following. But the definition of human research is very broad. It's really research that is conducted with or about people or their information or their biospecimens, if you like, through a variety of means. And so that's really quite wide. So it might encompass very high-level research, which leads to journals and journal publications and so on, but also teaching at undergraduate level, even if they are engaging with people in a certain way that warrants ethical review. I wouldn't point out that it's best to say it's not an exact science, but so it involves conversation, unpacking, and so on.
Great. So, obviously with that definition of human research, a lot of writing projects and creative writing projects, whether it's creative nonfiction, memoirs, or even certain research that might go into writing a novel might very well fall under this category of human research, which is really what we're talking about today. So, when we think about that, what would you say within a creative project? I know creative is generally a very big word, but what might potentially need ethics testing in a creative project?
Perhaps I can call upon a couple of examples.
That'd be great,
if someone is writing a novel is for the artifact part of the practice-led research, and wants that activity to be informed by something, that might involve going through archival material. It might involve interviews with people, it might involve observing people. And really that would come under the definition of human research that requires ethical review. In the case of archival material, it really depends on what's in that material and, for example, if some people are still alive. Because I mentioned the governance framework in which we operate. Of course, as a public sector organization in Victoria, we're also bound by privacy standards. And so this process actually might help to ensure that these standards are met as well. In the case of interviewing people, it matters what you're asking them and what's going to happen to the material and so on. Now, and in terms of creative arts projects, as I understand it, it's a bit different to where in another field of academic research you would be looking at that data and analyzing it in a different way, whereas this might be part of the process of informing something. And it's not leading to, say, publication based on the interviews, but to do that. And but I think the general principles might still apply.
That's
and
interesting, yeah. So perhaps if we could maybe talk through some examples, and you could tell me what, in a few of the examples that I might give you of types of creative writing projects, what might require ethics testing or ethics clearance. So let's say I'm writing a novel about a particular profession that I haven't been in myself, and so in order, as part of my part of the creative artifact for my PhD here. And so what I'm proposing to do is go out and interview a range of people who have been in that profession and get them to talk about their personal experience. So I'm not going to use them as characters in the novel or directly translate their personal experience into the novel, but I might use aspects of that as inspiration for my work. So would that require ethics clearance for those types of interviews?
As I understand it, yes.
Right,
yes.
right, okay.
Because you're effectively those people, you might say, are contributing to your research at some level, at some point.
Right.
And the part of this exercise, in a sense, is to demonstrate that the way that's being done is respectful, beneficial even, not harmful, that it's fair dealing, and really that the research has some merit and integrity to it.
Great, great, okay. Yep, so even though I won't directly be publishing the results of that research or their experience, I'll still need clearance about the process through which I'll go about acquiring that information.
I think so.
Right, yes. Good. Yep, that makes sense. Now going back to the idea of archival research, let's say I'm writing a historical novel, say set in Melbourne in the 1950s, and for one of the characters, I'm basing it quite closely on the experience of someone who's dead, but whose life I've been able to research through books or archival material or newspapers or so forth. However, I'm not going to use their exact name and background in my novel. I'm going to substantially fictionalize that information. Would I need research clearance, ethics clearance for that project?
I think that might need some unpacking.
Right.
I think if the person's not still alive and there's legitimate access to the archival material, I'd say no.
Right.
But it might also come back to, say, the cultural context for that person. So if that person, for example, was, say, from a particular cultural background, the researcher might need to think about that a bit more and perhaps engage with our office or a research and ethics advisor if you have one in your discipline area, to unpack that a bit to see whether it might warrant ethical review. If the archival material is still dealing with people who are still alive, then we may have to meet our privacy standards. I want to emphasize that what I'm talking about here is not saying you cannot do any of this.
Of course, no.
So I think it's very important to emphasize that. It's a challenge sometimes, and I think at the end of the day it relies very much on the researcher to explain some of this and show how they're dealing well with this information and so on. I think just straightforward the archival material for a person who is no longer alive, I think probably not.
Right. But of course, if you're going to go and say interview their family members alongside that, then anything involving interviews clearly needs research testing.
And I think another challenging area is perhaps where information might be publicly available.
Right.
And I think this is a challenge for us sometimes to work out whether it needs ethics clearance or not. But citing publicly available material, published material, using conventional academic citations and so on, doesn't need to come through this process. But given our privacy obligations, if, say, the researcher is then creating, as it were, a database or dossier on someone and is intending to use the material, then it might get a bit more interesting and we might have to be looked at. Because in that case, then you're starting to collect information about that person, and
so even if it's just for your own personal use, it would still.
I think perhaps I could make a distinction. Actually, calling it personal view as now. See, effectively, this exercise is applying to someone as a Swinburne student or as a Swinburne researcher. So to that extent, that's where some of the obligations come into play. I suppose a positive side for this exercise is maybe there's some value in this exercise anyway, because it might allow you to think through the issues and so on. But I think that these examples probably might need some conversation to work out whether it's, because as I said, it might warrant it sometimes, even if it's not mandatory, as it were. I don't wish to create more work for us, but
no, of course, So it might. There are some very broad areas in which research ethics testing is usually applicable, say with interviews or human research, and then there are others in creative projects where it might require more conversation. It might be a matter of I suppose, degree or...
And another area, I think, is observation. Now,
Yep.
that could be observation, say, observing in a street or
Right.
in wherever.
Yep.
What could be these days observing what's happening in social media.
That's a really interesting point, yes.
And I understand the term lurking is now come into play, and those projects will need ethical review. So even though it's, as it were, publicly accessible,
yes.
It's not always clear that it can be used any way one likes. And I think researchers sometimes also need to consider their own position sometimes, because we've had some anecdotal information that when somebody finds that the researcher has used their Facebook site or whatever it was for their research without permission, it can get a bit touchy, and the researcher might get some tough reaction. I think
that's interesting. So not everything that's in public accessible is fair game for research, or at least not without some, I suppose, protections or permissions being given.
Yes, I think this exercise has its tensions, I think, and I think it relies on the skill of the researcher to explain a lot of that.
Right.
I think, because I think to some extent the researcher might even be, if you like, educating the ethical reviewers who sit on the ethics committee and so on.
Good. Great. So one other sort of broad example that we might want to think about here, because we've talked about fictional writing at the moment, and let's say we have a PhD student who's writing a non-fiction work, a work of creative non-fiction, like a memoir, or some travel writing, or a personal recollection. So in terms of writing a memoir about your own life and your own experiences, and you might be talking about your memories of other people, of family members, of friends, or personal connections you've made in the past, would that also require some ethics testing?
I think, again, I'd want to have a conversation early in the piece, I think, not just me personally, but I think some thinking through that just to work out whether that warrants some sort of ethical review. I think we don't get that many complaints, for example, but we've had the odd situation where someone is upset about being named in a research output, a publication, a journal article, and so on, and say, look, I didn't give permission for that to happen. I think this process might also in some ways protect the researcher, because they've gone through a process, and an independent review body, as it were, has said, look, what you proposed, we're able to say it passes muster. It appears to meet the guidelines that we're obliged to follow. I mean, I've got to be careful what I say here, but I mean, there was a notorious case in Australia where a novelist got sued. Perhaps I won't mention the novel, but I think that was interesting, where you have a fictional piece that allowed identification, and it seemed to have been backed up in a court of law. But I'm not a lawyer,
enough evidence was given that a character that was put to be fiction in the novel could be recognisably tied to a real life figure of some kind.
And the person was with the term slandered or libelled in there, in a way. So,
yes, those are some of the risks.
But that's an extreme case, I think. I certainly make a point that this exercise might help to think through, identify and think through some of the issues.
Good. Great. Now the other component of the research PhD for writing at Swinburne is the exegesis, which is in part a critical and creative reflection on the creative writing process, often where we're asking students to reflect on the process that the creative process that they went through in realizing the artifact. So, and I just thought it might be a good idea to think about if there is anything potentially in exegesis that might require ethics review. If you're talking about your own creative process, say if you wanted to talk about how your family, if you don't mention your family in the artifact that you've written, but you wanted to talk about how relations with your family impacted on the creative, on the process of creating that artifact. Would that require some ethical review or permissions from them to mention them?
I think, again, coming back to that conversation, I think perhaps that's needed there. Maybe it could be started by an approach on the part of the researcher to say, how would they feel, how would they react
Right,
to what
right.
I'm going
Yeah.
to do, and
Yeah.
if I feel like if I was in their position, how would I like to be
Yeah.
treated, perhaps,
Yeah.
and that might lead to perhaps unpacking this a
Right,
bit
right.
more, I think.
And that's really good because, I mean, it seems like a lot of the process of ethical review for research projects involves maybe trying to anticipate possible areas where people might be hurt, damaged, or upset by the research output, or the process of acquiring that information. And that is actually a really important consideration for writers of all kinds to make, be it creative or engaged in kind of critical or analytic research.
And I think this might also relate, I think, to even a professional side to all of this, because it's this fair trading, fair dealing with people. And, I can think of situations in some cultural or indigenous communities where art has, as it were, been used, abused, or misused, or people not properly recognized for their contributions and so on. And this process hopefully might help in addressing that to some extent.
Great. So perhaps maybe could you, drawing on some of your own experience, would you like to talk a little bit about what might be some of the challenging aspects for the ethics committees that might be looking at creative research projects in terms of testing and reviewing the ethics of these projects?
I think the various perceptions and perspectives immediately come into play. It's important to realize that the ethics committee has its own obligation. So the university sets terms of reference for it, and it needs to abide by that. And in terms of these national ethics guidelines, a member of an ethics committee is required to make an independent judgment that the proposals put forward for review meet the terms of this document and is ethically acceptable, almost those words. So it's perhaps it's also to appreciate the constraints under which the ethics committee operates. Now, creative arts research stretches the boundaries, widens the horizons. One could go on like this, and there's quite a lot of unusual, extraordinary methods or aspects to the research. And I think that is a challenge for ethics committees, particularly when perhaps 90% of the applications looking at follows various conventions that are easily accessible and so on. So I think I think realizing that, but also realizing that the ethics committee is there, really is not there to stop the research. The ethics committee will have to ask questions about will it justify what you're doing, the harms that could result from that. But so the committee would want to be clear what it is being asked to review. So it's this challenge of the researcher clarifying what's happening. And some of the academic conventions come into play there. So clear language, consistency in the detail. So sometimes you have too little detail, but sometimes there's a temptation on the part of some researchers to deluge the ethics committee with too much detail. And the committee saying, "Oh, this is just too much. I mean, what are they really trying to do?" And I think the committee also, I think in some sense, might have to have its own understandings broadened by this. And I think this is where I think the skill of the researcher comes into play. Because the ethics committee also has an obligation to facilitate ethically sound research. So really this process is designed to demonstrate that. But I think, as I said, sometimes there's too little detail, sometimes too much detail. And of course you're using standard formats here, and that's a challenge for a lot of people, even startup conventional researchers, if you like, in other disciplines. But so translating what you're doing into a mundane application form can present a challenge too. But that creates a challenge sometimes where on one page you appear to say yes, on another page you appear to say no, and really that it negates one or the other. So really the committee is looking to having a well-prepared proposal being put forward, and that demonstrates that the researchers on top of what they're doing, they know what's happening. And really, it's showing respect for the people who are contributing to that research.
Great. So sort of in broad terms, if I'm working on a creative project as part of a Swinburne Research PhD, what I need to think is, the first question I might need to ask is, does any aspect of my research involve human research in the terms that we've talked about earlier? And then think about the requirements that the ethics committee will be looking for in terms of this documentation, and thinking about how I can explain my research methodology in a way that conforms to some of those requirements. in clear, precise language.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of resources you can call upon. I mean,
Great.
most obviously your supervisor,
Yes.
but colleagues.
Yeah.
There is a lot of resource material on the web these days. Our office, our
Great.
website, and I think a fair degree of common sense sometimes
Yes.
I think is not amiss in this activity. But yes, so there's help available, as it were, and I think not to be put off. And I would even say, you know, in the best possible sense of this word, exploit this process.
Right. Yeah.
Use it to help you to refine your
Yeah.
what you're doing, what you're proposing, and how you're going to carry it out. Use it as a way to communicate what you're doing,
Yes.
and so on.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
rather than just see it as an obstacle course and just ethics by tick box
Yeah.
and this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a way of reflecting on the process by which you're going to be acquiring the information that will drive the project, and also how you're going to present those results, which is really important there. Yeah.
I might just also add, actually, I think sometimes I think this wider perspective does help sometimes, because we can get the either very enthusiastic or an experienced researcher who's sort of setting forth into very unfamiliar territory themselves, and perhaps having that wider perspective helps to for a bit more critical reflection on what's to happen, and so you don't go out there and find yourself in great strife or in danger in some instances, I think. And so the committee's got this obligation to ensure that even the researchers' rights and interests need to be looked at.
That's a good point to raise, yeah. And the process might take a few drafts or some preparation sometimes to get it right, and
preferably those drafts before we get
before the final application.
Because I mean, I guess this exercise is actually quite requires a bit of commitment on the part of ethics reviewers, and of course they're not paid to do the job. And so and the ethics committees, in fact, are made up of a variety of backgrounds. There has to be at least 2 lay people, at least 1 lay woman, 1 lay man, who's not involved in the university or engaged in academic or medical or scientific or legal work. There's got to be at least somebody with a pastoral care background, like a minister of religion, an Aboriginal elder, someone with a professional care and counselling background, like a social worker, a clinical psychologist, a nurse or a doctor, someone with a legal background, and at least 2 researchers who are familiar with the research that's coming for review.
Right. So it sort of covers every base in that sense, or as many as possible.
And that background can sometimes help, I think, with because I mean the researchers are not going to cover all bases themselves, and this process can and occasionally does help in addressing certain issues that were not thought of before.
So it can point out issues that the researcher wouldn't have immediately considered, or that even the supervisors might not have even thought about when presenting that. So that's great. Okay, well, thanks. That's been a really good introduction to the topic of research ethics for, I think, writing PhDs here at Swinburne. And of course, more information is available on the research integrity and ethics website. And often the first port of call will be talking over these issues with your supervisors as well. So. Great. Thank you very much, Keith. Thanks.
I'm glad to have had this opportunity, Julian.
Great. Brilliant. And thank you. See you next time.
This has been a Swinburne production.